It's a great pleasure to see you all, and also it's a great pleasure to see such interest in this topic. My name is Dan Keiman, and I am the educational lead at the Open Foundation. And this is an ongoing conversation on autism and psychedelics with our very dear guest, Nick Walker. First, about the Open Foundation, we're dedicated to creating a space for open, critical, and interdisciplinary conversations around non-ordinary states or altered states of consciousness, science, and society, and in specific around psychedelics. And in doing so, we organize events like this one, but we also host a interdisciplinary conference on psychedelic research, ICPR, which takes place every 2 years in Haarlem. We build a community of researchers, practitioners, and other curious minds that just want to hear more about this. In a moment, I'll ask Nick to introduce himself, but Nick has been one of the pioneers if it comes to the neurodiversity paradigm, and has written a lot about autism. In a moment, I'll ask Nick to introduce himself, and then we're pretty much going to dive in. For those of you that haven't seen the recording last time, we'll do a very brief recap, just asking Nick to offer a bit of a definition of autism so that we're all kind of oriented to this particular way of thinking about autism before diving into this beautiful intersection between autism and psychedelics. Um, and of course, we want to have a lot of time for you. One of the reasons that we wanted to continue this conversation is because the last time when Allison and Nick were here, we got so many. Alicia and Nick were here. We got so many questions that we couldn't answer that we wanted to continue um, uh, this conversation. And if you have any questions, there's a couple of ways to ask them. The easiest is in the chat. You will find a link. Yulia is my dear colleague that will take your questions and put them in a file. So whenever you see me look to the bottom left of my screen, I'm trying to see what kind of questions you might have. And another way is by raising your hand. There's this raise hand function on Zoom, and then we might call upon you to unmute and share your question with us publicly. Um, this event is being recorded, so please be aware that if that is something you feel uncomfortable with, to just post your question in the chat. Um, But maybe now, without further ado, Nick, could you do us the honor of introducing yourself, maybe sharing a few words why you think you're here?
Yes. Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me here. Dr. Nick Walker. I'm a professor of psychology at California Institute of Integral Studies, and I helped to design the new undergraduate psychedelic studies program there. So we're about to launch it in about 3 weeks, where we're launching the first Bachelor of Science in Psychedelic Studies program in the world. And so I've been very busy focused on that. Very excited to get welcome uh, to new cohorts of students into the field of psychedelics. So, yeah, let's see. I'm a transdisciplinary scholar, kind of omnivorous in my interests, and psychedelics have, been a long time passion of mine. And really anything to do with consciousness and the expansion and transformation of consciousness, and is part of that. And being autistic myself, about a quarter of a century now, I got involved in writing about autism and sort of helping to establish the foundations of what's come to be called the neurodiversity paradigm, and what's grown into a field of neurodiversity studies. So that has been a big aspect of my work along the way. And I'm delighted that the fields of psychedelics and of neurodiversity studies at this point are at the point where they're really starting to intersect more, where we're seeing these fun interdisciplinary things where people are interested. How do these topics go together? So that's all I'll say for now. We'll let other things emerge as the questions come.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, maybe the first question, and this is for me, it's been a big process to go from a very narrow initial understanding of what autism was, which almost conjured up quite pathological images of people utterly unable to take care of themselves, going
Hmm.
through meltdowns, and over time, I started to realize that this is a very particular way of looking at autism, a very particular typical, or a very particular expression of what we might call autism. And starting to read your work, I was really touched by this quite radically different way of conceptualizing of what autism is, and also there's a deep strand of depathologization in your work. And so
Hmm.
some people here might be mental health care experts that have not been exposed to this neurodiversity paradigm, this completely different way of thinking about autism and what the problem is. And so maybe you can offer us a very brief introduction for those of you that for those of the people here that we're not here the first time, and might have missed that part of the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And I have a book out called Neuroqueer Heresies that goes into this in some more detail. So I'm going to just put that title in the chat right now for those who are unfamiliar and are interested in further reading on the neurodiversity paradigm. Though I'm a little embarrassed about the book at this point because it was published, I wrote it in 2021, published at the end of 2021, and my views have continued to evolve. So I'm always embarrassed about anything that I wrote, 3 or 4 years ago. It's like, oh, I wish I'd said that differently, and this such an so outdated. So I'm doing more writing now, which will appear in the next couple of years. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about autism and what it is. So in in the sort of field of psychology and related adjacent fields, there's been a lot of misconception around autism because it's traditionally been framed uh, by people who are not autistic. It's been framed from the outside. So sort of like, in the 1800s and early 1900s up until the era of post-colonial anthropology was very often uh, colonizers from the Europe and North America who were writing about indigenous cultures as if they were, this foreign exotic thing, and as if, the European North American culture was sort of the ideal and everything else was primitive or quaint or exotic. And so you had that sort of exoticizing look of uh, uh, the stories of indigenous people in anthropology were always being told from the outside. And that's the same thing happened around the discourse in psychology on autism, and sort of the general public discourse was it was always uh, autistic people's stories and lives being interpreted from the outside. And so if you look still at a diagnostic manual, for instance, like the DSM or the ICD, what you'll see is autism described in this very pathological way, and it's described as this series of diagnostic criteria, this series of symptoms, and it's all about how it looks to an outsider, how it looks to a non-autistic person from the outside, who's assuming that their non-autistic perspective and non-autistic way of thinking and doing and being is uh, is the natural default, and any deviation from it is wrong and uh, deficient in some way. So, because of this perspective, uh, there's been um, there's been a misconception of autism as uh, being at its core some collection of social and communication deficits, deficits in ability to connect with people and communicate with people. And obviously, what's happening there is the autistic people and non-autistic people have very different perceptions and very different ways of thinking, very different cognitive and perceptual styles. And so there's a communication gap there. And so from the perspective of, a non-autistic psychological establishment, the way autistic people are doing it is wrong. And if there's a communication gap, it must be because autistic people are deficient, which is sort of like, you know, meeting someone from another country who speaks a different language from you and saying, well, they have a language deficiency because I can't understand them. And so, um, the so so what is autism actually at its core is the interesting question here. And the core the core phenomenon at uh, sort of at the root of autism is uh, a particular thing that happens in the cortex. So we have, our cognitive and perceptual processes, happen as webs of connection, webs of neural connection in the cortex and in the brain there. And there's this fascinating phenomenon with cortical neurons where starting in the womb, there's this very intense growth of cortical neurons. They're sort of like the cortex is very ready to receive information and be shaped by our perceptions and our actions. So neurons kind of form these webs of connection between them, these webs of connection and these patterns of connection, and everything we know and our personalities, our actions, the things that we learn to do, all of this stuff gets encoded in the cortex as these webs of neural connection. So uh, what happens in early childhood and starting in the womb and infancy and early childhood is there's this intense overgrowth of cortical neurons as we get ready to receive all this information. And then there's also a dying off. So neurons that don't get used die off and get pruned. And eventually the sort of equilibrium is reached. With autistic people, the pruning doesn't happen or doesn't happen as much. And so you get a very intense density of cortical neurons, of what's called the cortical mini columns, which are the sort of long strings of neurons that connect with each other. So there's this intense, when you get this intense density of cortical neurons, what happens is there's less room for them, and so they're less insulated from each other, and they connect more easily. So you get, on the one hand, a heightened neuroplasticity, and on the other hand, bleed through where signals traveling one line of neurons will neural connections will jump to adjacent lines of neural connection. And so you get, on the one hand, this intense neuroplasticity, and on the other hand, you get a high level of intense sensory experience, and almost a more chaotic experience because of the ways that neural signals will ripple onto other neural pathways. So you get a lot of phenomena like synesthesia, and very interesting uh, phenomena. The result of it is the uh, we live in a world of sensory information. We don't perceive reality is the straight up objective way. It's filtered through our senses. And so we get sensory information, we take in sensory information, and our brains turn it into a coherent picture of the world we're experiencing. And part of that coherence is filtering out a lot of sensory information. A lot of it just gets filtered. What we can't immediately turn into something coherent, what we haven't learned to process, just gets filtered out of our experience a lot of the time. So with autistic people, you get a lot less filtering. You get less sensory filtering, a lot more raw sensory experience, which is harder to turn into a coherent picture. Now, um, I'll talk about the consequences of that in a moment, but I want to point something out right here, which is, uh, if you've read Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, um, this is what psychedelics like LSD do also, right? They uh psychedelics, among other things, they disrupt the ordinary filtering that we've developed, so that suddenly we're taking in sensory information, and that's outside of our usual patterns of perception. And it's like these doors of perception, the gates that filter our perceptual information and our cognition, get disrupted when we take psychedelics. So there's this window of neuroplasticity that opens, and suddenly we're taking in information in ways that are not part of our ingrained habits of perception and cognition. And so, you know, you think about that, like what's happening for autistic people all the time is the level of sensory intensity and cognitive, you know, uh, intense, intense load of information to make sense of, that we often encounter in psychedelic experiences as well. So right there, there's this interesting autism psychedelics connection. Um, anyway, for autistic people, this more intense sensory experience means making a coherent picture of the world is harder. There's more sensory information and more sensory chaos that one has to turn into coherence. And everything else about autism, all of the things that are reported about autism from the outside by, non-autistic professionals and such, is really explainable by that. So autistic social difficulties, for instance, are not because autistic people are missing some basic capacity for empathy or connection, but because in early childhood, when non-autistic children are starting to form the the basic neural pathways for social connection, when they're starting to uh, pick up on the rhythms of social connection of people around them. They're starting to attune socially. That happens at a very early age. It starts happening in infancy, long before language. Autistic children at that time in their development are using much more of their cognitive bandwidth to just make sense of the world on a sensory level because it's a harder task with more sensory information. And so it's a slower process to pick up the social stuff. And of course, for children who take more time to start picking up on uh, the social, they miss out on these opportunities for early social connection. And there's a vicious cycle that happens from there. Lack of social connection and lack of positive social bonding experiences puts them further and further behind with the social development. And so what's really going on, though, is at the core, again, is just it takes them longer to reach that point in their development because of the intensity of their sensory experience, because what Piaget called the sensory motor stage of development takes so much more time and occupies so much more attention for autistic children. Um, Similarly, you know, it's like autistic people get stereotyped as unimaginative or rigid because they tend to like routines and repetition. But that makes perfect sense, not as rigidity or a limitation of imagination, but just as a strategy for managing the intense chaos of sensory experience. How do you manage it if if your experience of the world is continually potentially overwhelming? Best way to manage it is establish routines, establish repetition so that there's less chaos that one has to navigate. So, all of these things, and of course, also, the um, what Don mentioned earlier, um, sort of the stereotypical, autistic people who really can't navigate the world on their own at all, and have difficulty with, oral speech or with uh, with basic daily tasks of navigating the world. Um, what's happening there, it really is a matter of sensory awareness. With too much sensory information, keeping track of just where one's body is difficult, right? A lot of the time, I mean, for, traditionally autistic people who can't speak have been stereotyped as being mentally deficient in some way. But actually, it's just hard to speak uh, if you can't organize your sensory world enough to feel what your mouth is doing. So, um, that's the basic what is autism thing, and of course it is extremely heterogeneous and wildly varied in its manifestations. Autistic people are wildly different from each other because of this high level of neuroplasticity, because different autistic people uh, find different cognitive strategies. And with that high level of neuroplasticity, autistic neural structures end up very different, very sort of dramatically individualized and customized. But that high level of neuroplasticity, high level of intensity is sort of the ubiquitous underlying characteristic. So yeah, that's my what is autism introduction there. And I think that'll give us a lot to work with, particularly around, well, how does that intersect with psychedelic experience and the way that psychedelics open up windows of neuroplasticity and give us different opportunities to form new neural pathways, new pathways of neural connection.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's a great joy to listen to you, and you're very clear in how you explain this. Maybe jumping off from this and indeed kind of like looking at this intersection of psychedelics and autism. You are one of the principal architects of this new undergraduate program at CIES,
Yes.
Psychedelic
Hmm.
Studies, and you've been really shaping and developing the curriculum. And so, one
Yes.
thing that I've been curious about is if you could perhaps elaborate on how you've designed that program with neurodivergent students in mind, but maybe more relevant for people that really want to work with psychedelics. How are you preparing those students to also take neurodivergence at large and autism in specific into consideration as they're moving potentially into the field of psychedelic assisted therapy, for example?
Right. Well, we certainly talk about it in the curriculum, in class. So it's a topic that gets, it's a topic that we'll cover. Um, and I suspect I'll probably end up offering some sort of neurodiversity and psychedelics elective, which hasn't been developed yet because we're still just right now rolling out the core curriculum. But I think we're headed in that direction in terms of, as we develop more elective courses in response to demand. But yeah, I think that's going to be a key thing in the curriculum. Of course, there's so many different aspects to cover, but in covering um, just in covering uh, psychedelics in general and what are their effects, we have to address the fact that, well, you can't just say this psychedelic compound has this effect on the brain and on consciousness because there's not just sort of one brain that we're working with. It's a variable, it's a continual variable. Every mind, every body mind is different. Uh every nervous system is a little different. uh People's cognition is different. So that's something we have to take into account and address, that whether or not you're looking at like, oh, this client has, an autism diagnosis or something, you're still dealing with the fact that the experience, the psychedelic experience happens at the intersection of what the psychedelic compound does and what is the mind that is encountering the psychedelic compound, and it's going to affect different minds differently. So um, that's a crucial topic that is sort of reiterated throughout the curriculum. You can't just say, oh, this this dosage, this dosage of psilocybin, this dosage of MDMA is going to have this effect because the person is different. You have to say, what is the effect it's going to have on this person? We don't know until we try. So, uh, in a sense, so I mean, as every psychedelic user knows, each each psychedelic experience is an experiment we don't know the result of, even with a single individual. And when you're talking about, with each single individual, each time it's different because the mind is different.
I think this is one of the
Mhm.
sentences and it's definitely a deeper sentiment that I've come to really appreciate in the autistic community is the sense of if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
Yes.
You probably know who coined that phrase. Um, One thing that stands out in what you just said is that there's a study that I think it's called SILE-AUT. It's a SILE-AUT study where they're giving autistic folks and non-autistic folks 2 and 5 milligrams of psilocybin respectively, and try to
Hmm.
map if there are structural differences in a functional MRI scanner.
Hmm.
So if basically trying to map if there are differences. And so I was curious how, if you think about these types of studies, what kind of criteria can they practically use to say, oh, that's the type of autistic person that we're investigating, because in, there's such incredible differences between neurotypes, even within this vast umbrella category of autism. What are they actually researching?
Right. And that's a good question. And I think that in a sense, we there's an awareness emerging culturally. There's a broader awareness emerging of neurodiversity, of the idea that, just like people are, diverse in their genders and sexual orientations, and we're ethnically diverse, where humans are an ethnically diverse species and a culturally diverse species, right? We are a neurocognitively diverse species. And that awareness, of course, is good. Is something that I and many other neurodiversity scholars have been working on spreading. Um, and that started with the emergence of the concept of neurodiversity within the autistic community. Uh, um, but I think that we're running into the limitations of the concept of neurotypes. I think that it putting people in boxes ultimately becomes limiting and destructive at some point, and we saw that, right? We had there was this historically there was this period of global exploration as people built ships and crossed oceans and sort of discovered, okay, uh, humans are wildly ethnically and culturally diverse, more than we thought. And then, uh, you know, um, then like Western European colonizers started enslaving people, and we got the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade and such, and people uh moved from this understanding of like, wow, we're wildly ethnically diverse uh, to developing this concept of race and classifying people by race as a way of creating hierarchies and justifying enslavement and discrimination and such. Um, and so that becomes a destructive model of going from, oh wow, there's a lot of different ways for people to be, to let's sort people into these categories and build hierarchies. Like at that point it becomes limiting and destructive, and we're still, as a world, as a society, reckoning with like the consequences of people buying into this constructed fiction of race. The And I think that we're running into the limitations of the idea of neurotype. I don't use It's a term I don't use in my writing anymore, and I was using it a dozen years ago. And one of the many things I wish I could take back, because it's not that simple. And yeah, there are people that you can classify as autistic. There's a particular tendency, as I just described at length in terms of the neurology of it. There's people you can say, oh, these people fall under the heading of autistic, but there's gray areas around the borders of that. And um, it fades into other things. All of these categories are ultimately subjective, even if you can objectively say, okay, well, there's a greater density of cortical neurons in this brain than in this brain. What's actually, the categories aren't actually so neat. The categories don't really capture the full diversity of humans and the fact that all of us ultimately have our own individual path of development and shape our brains through our activities and our experiences and our choices. Uh, so uh, I'm I think that it's valuable to do studies and to say, okay, well, we want to recruit autistic people for this study because, these people who we call autistic have these encounter these particular issues, and psychedelics might be helpful to them in a particular way, might have a particular might be we might see particular results if we have an autistic group of study participants, that if we with a non-autistic group, what are the differences here? Let's learn about that. This is worth researching, this is worth exploring, but it is ultimately, a culturally constructed illusion, autistic, non-autistic, and I think we shouldn't fixate on it too much. We shouldn't think of autistic people and non-autistic people as too different, because what you're going to see in terms of psychedelic experience is that you know, again, it's wildly varied in non-autistic people, in autistic people, and you might get, you take a group of autistic people and give them a particular dose of a particular psychedelic, and you take a group of non-autistic people, you give them that, same dose, and you might find that like your results don't fit neatly into, well, all the autistic people had this experience or the non-autistic people had this experience. You might find, okay, no, you can actually sort this into like groups of people who had intense visual experiences, groups of people who had transcendent spiritual experiences, groups of people who didn't really like the experience and didn't find it helpful. And you'll find that all of those different groups have both autistic and non-autistic people uh, in it. And so I think that's important too. Like we want to be aware that autistic people face specific issues. And as when we're doing psychedelic assisted therapy, when we're researching clinical applications of psychedelics, we want to look at that. We want to look at, well, what are the specific issues autistic people face? But we don't necessarily, I think it becomes limiting and potentially destructive, or, to 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 make too much of these artificial divisions, to make too much of the idea, uh, the idea that these are entirely separate groups. I would like to see, while I like to see studies of like, okay, well, sure, let's try out this particular psychedelic approach, or treatment, psychedelic assisted treatment approach with autistic people and with non-autistic people, and compare it. I'd also like to see just more recruitment of autistic people as part of the general population for studies. Like, okay, we're gonna do a study of, like another study of, uh MDMA treatment for post-traumatic stress, or psilocybin for people coping with approaching end of life, or these topics that people are currently studying. Like, what if autism was not an exclusion criteria and they weren't treated as a special different population, but like we're about 2% of the population. So what if it was just like, okay, well, if we're doing a large scale study, about 2% of our test subject should be autistic. That's just they're just part of the population. It's like I don't think in this day and age, for instance, that you would see, most reputable psychedelic researchers, wouldn't be like, well, this study is only open to heterosexuals because gay people's minds are too different from ours. So that's this whole separate thing. We're not studying homosexuality, so we're not going to have any gay people in our study of MDMA treatments for PTSD. Like that sounds very, 1950s, but we don't see it in this day and age. It's like you might ask someone sexual orientation on a demographic questionnaire, of your participants, but nobody's ruled out of the study for being queer, or for their ethnicity. And so I think the same thing with autism and other forms of neurodivergence, like something to be aware of as one of the many human variations we're going to encounter. But uh, uh, I think the segregation is a mistake. I think it becomes destructive when we start sorting people by neurotype and segregating them on that ground.
This is excellent. And one thing that immediately comes to mind is I was reading some research recently that suggested that at the very least within this type of research that they were citing, they found that autistic adults had a lower amount of serotonin receptors. And I was thinking, oh, that's interesting because I actually know a few autistic adults who, when they take MDMA, need to take very high doses in order to have the effects.
Mm.
But immediately, I also realized I know at least two autistic adults who need extremely low amounts because they are so
Uh-huh.
incredibly sensitive. And so when we take this notion that, oh, this study found that, and we have this assumption that, oh, probably autistic people have lower serotonin receptors, we need to give them higher doses. We start off on a premise that can be incredibly harmful. And so
Yeah.
this notion of neuroinclusivity, where we just assume that people have different responses to different doses and to different substances at different points in time, opens us up to a much more responsive conversation with someone that goes beyond this particular way of diagnosing them or categorizing them,
Right.
as you
And
say.
again, every person's chemistry is unique. And with autistic people, I think there's even more of that because, I mean, you can look, you can look biologically at like number of serotonin receptors, something like that. But uh the brains are not static. There's they're affected by what we do with them. So there's this like, okay, there's this kind of density of neurons, and this part of the brain is this size, and this brain has more serotonin receptors than this one. But that doesn't take into account um how the person is using their brain, right? How is the person actually living, and what effect does that have? Because there's there's the serotonin receptors, but there's people who have plenty of serotonin receptors, maybe, um, who can still have, a lot of difficulty getting high on anything, for instance, because of how they live and how that affects what aspects of their neurocognitive structures they can actually access and utilize. It's like it's not so much, we sometimes pay too much attention to what neurocognitive and biological equipment a person has, and not to the effect of what they're doing with it. And what we're doing with it is kind of the more important thing. That are we, are how are we, um, what are we doing to enable access? What are we doing to deploy those serotonin receptors that we have? Um, what are we doing with the various neurological structures we have? And if we just start looking at the biology of the brain as if it's static, as if our choices and how we use it don't matter. We're doing phrenology at a higher tech level, basically. Um, so yeah, I think that uh, it's really interesting to look at just, you want to start everyone off on a low dose, I think, most of the time, because you never know. You never know. Some people, I mean, on the one hand, you can say, oh, well, autistic people have fewer serotonin receptors. So this should, they might need a higher dose. But what about the fact that we're starting out with a higher level of neuroplasticity and a higher density of cortical neurons, so the serotonin receptors may affect how much of that substance hits the brain.
Mhm.
But what about what it does once it's in the brain? That's going to be the cognitive effects can be really greatly exaggerated. You might not need as much of a drug to reach the cortex, because what does reach the cortex is going to have a more profound effect because of the higher density of cortical neurons. There's so many variables in play. I'll tell you, I've always had very positive experiences with psychedelics myself, and I don't think I need larger doses than anybody else. My experience seems to be, um, on par with the non-autistic people with whom I've done psychedelics, in terms of, just how what happens, how intense an effect we get from a given dose. Um, the effects are different from me. The way that I work with it is different for me. And there's other strange things, I know I need larger doses of painkillers than non-autistic people. I seem to, which is something a lot of autistic people experience. I seem to need uh, a larger dose. To have an effect. And then there's just random stuff. Caffeine makes me sleepy. I tried Ritalin once. I'm not ADHD, but I tried Ritalin once to see if it would help me concentrate the way that it helps ADHD people concentrate. And it turns out that Ritalin is a psychedelic for me. So it did not make me more productive because I was hallucinating wildly, and it was delightful. Uh, but uh, the and again, you quoted that line about if you've met one you've met one autistic person. This is just me. This is just my particular strange brain chemistry. Um, at, which is a result of who knows, a combination of autism and what my brain is primed for and how it handles things based on how I actually live and how I actually think. And with every other autistic person, it's going to be different.
This is excellent, and I think for me a big takeaway it is really to always lead with this deep curiosity towards whoever your client is, whether expected autistic or not, or um, as I'm kind of like orienting here towards some questions from people in the audience. One question is, what is the current validity of psychedelic assisted therapy with children around the age of 6? Do studies look promising, or should I focus on different therapies, i.e. social? If so, what? And I want to note that obviously we cannot give any recommendations here because we don't know who this particular case is, so maybe we can depersonalize a little and just could you speak to what you know about the potential therapeutic benefits of psychedelics for autistics in general, and maybe autistic children in specific. And
I don't think
yeah,
anybody should be giving psychedelics to children.
oh, yeah,
That's just a no because they're uh, you don't give psychedelics to children for the same reason you don't have sex with children because they are not yet old enough to understand what they're getting into, or it's sort of not old enough to legitimately consent. It's just it's exploitive. It's like you can't you um it's really one of those things where there should be, just like with sex, there needs to be a firmly established age of consent. And I think I mean, I think it's malpractice and should probably be prosecuted if someone is giving psychedelics to children, regardless of what they claim it's for. Um, and especially autistic children. I mean, children in general. And autistic children, remember, you've got this very complex, with the high level of neuroplasticity they already have, you've got this very complex developmental process, and that really needs to be very carefully guided in its development, in terms of helping autistic people, helping developing autistic minds, young autistic minds especially, learn to do sensory integration. I'm a very big fan of non-pathologizing uh, occupational therapy, sensory integration therapy for autistic kids, where they can learn to manage their sensory experience better so that they can navigate the world more easily, not be overwhelmed on a sensory level. If you're giving them psychedelics, I don't know what people think they're going to do by giving an autistic kid psychedelics, but it's a terrible idea because you're amping up the intensity of the sensory and cognitive experience at this crucial stage where the child is trying to learn to manage the intensity they've got to deal with, the natural intensity of their experience. So terrible idea. Don't do it. Don't give psychedelics to autistic kids. Um, I see a question in the chat. Would you include ketamine as well in not treating adolescents? Yeah, yeah, I would absolutely. Remember, with autistic people, and especially developing autistics, because adolescents are still developing cognitively. Teenagers love to think of themselves as adults, and but again, there's reasons that we don't let people have sex with 14-year-olds, because they love to think of themselves as adults, but those minds are still developing. They're not there yet. We want to give them respect their autonomy, but so part of that, and kids are of course going to try all sorts of drugs on their own recreationally and experimentally and such. I certainly did, starting at a very early age, but uh that's a different situation from uh uh, uh you know giving it to them in a clinical setting. The thing with ketamine here, remember, again, with autistic people, one of the issues is that you've got this intense sensory experience creates what's called dyspraxia, these difficulties with physical coordination, and alexithymia, which is a difficulty identifying one's emotional uh, states. And that's all about, um, again, the fact that with a really intense sensory experience, it's hard to track one's own body. How do you track your own emotional experience and regulate your own emotional experience when it's hard to feel what's happening in your body, right? How do you coordinate your body? How do you develop physical coordination when it's harder to feel where your body is? So a lot of the developmental work and a lot of the reasons I'm a big advocate of things like occupational therapy and sensory integration therapy, a lot of that developmental work is learning to attune to to one's physical state. Given the importance of that work for autistic people and how delicate it is during the developmental years, I would absolutely not recommend ketamine because it's dissociative. You're undoing the work of helping, if there's such a central developmental task is to tune into their bodily states, don't give them a dissociative. You're undoing good work there. So yeah, I would say that definitely applies to ketamine. See another good question in the chat. Let's see. Would the need for predictability in autistic adults not make it hard for a lot of people with autism, autistic people, please, not make it hard for a lot of autistic people to not get very scared and by the state of mind psychedelics brings them in? Well, again, I mean, for one thing, set and setting, you know, I mean, you want to set up a safe environment, you're doing uh, you're doing clinical work, whether it's a study or psychedelic assisted therapy. Um, well, you got to set up a safe environment. Um, but also, um, again, here's where I think uh, we're stereotyping autistic people and othering them because non-autistic people get really freaked out by psychedelics and really scared by psychedelic states, which is why, I mean, when the early psychedelic pioneers, when Leary and Groff and Metzner and all that were talking of, coming up with this idea of the importance of set and setting for psychedelics, they weren't working with autistic people. They were observing that non-autistic people freak out very easily. Um, uh, Autistic people tend to like routine because if things are predictable, it uses less bandwidth uh, mentally. Fewer things they have to keep track of. If there's an established routine, makes it easier to parse what's happening. That's different from an intentional experimental situation, right? They uh, 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 you're confusing possibly uh, benefiting from routine is not the same as being scared of the unknown, because fear of the unknown is largely a neurotypical thing. I mean, fear of the unknown is, again, I'm not in favor of stereotyping and I'm not in favor of dividing people into neurotypes, but the neurotypical, the non-neurodivergent people, the cognitive majority in the world, from my perspective as an autistic person, their defining feature is fear of the unknown. And so, in my experience, autistic people on average have less fear of the unknown than non-autistic people. We're much more accustomed to dealing with intense sensory experience. We're much more accustomed to encountering overwhelm, to not knowing what's going on, um, uh, and to doing things in a very experimental way of I'm going to try this thing which seems really strange and unnatural to me, and you know I mean, just having coping mechanisms for overwhelm. Yeah, I think autistic people are uh um much less likely to get freaked out by plunging into unknown territory than non-autistic people. We have a natural advantage there because we have more experience with it, right? I mean, if you're neurotypical, if you're a member of the cognitive majority and you're used to the world being designed for the way that you think and perceive, um, it's more scary to be out of your depth than for an autistic person who is used to being out of their depth just in everyday life. I'll tell you um, personally uh, that my early use of psychedelics starting when I was about 14 um, was just just tripping with my friends, just you know, hanging out with all the punks and metalheads, and in my school, and just romping around. I mean, we were not good at the whole set and setting concept. It wasn't like, oh, we have a nice quiet space to trip. It was like, okay, let's do acid and go to a show. Let's do acid and go to the shopping mall. It's very um, you know, just kids recklessly having fun as we do. And the the thing was, we do these big doses of LSD and just go out playing in the world. Um, and the rest of the people I was hanging out with were not autistic. And so that level of intense sensory experience and uh, wild cognitive experience, ideas popping up all over the place outside of the usual boxes they're used to thinking in, and uh, uh, you know, oh wow, look at my hand move and all that fun teenage psychedelic stuff. Um, I mean, they were not very good at being inconspicuous or having to deal with you know, what happens when the police approach you. And so dealing with that stuff, like dealing with sudden encounters with adult authorities, was my job in that circle of friends, because I was the one who was used to having conversations with adults where I was, you know, in a very different state of mind than the adults talking to me, and I was used to being able to carry on a conversation and act like everything was just fine. So, being autistic gave me a real advantage there. I was the one who you know okay, I'm tripping so hard that I can't exactly tell what's real and what's not. And I spent my entire early childhood that way, so I don't feel out of my depth the way these non-autistic friends are. So yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, there are certain advantages that the autistic experience confers in that regard, where in some ways, you know, our lives prepare us well for psychedelic exploration. Oh, let's see. Follow-up question in the chat. Have there been many studies of, say, psilocybin as a treatment for depression in autistic people specifically? I have not seen those yet. Like the big one, of course, Alicia Danforth was here with me the last time I did this. Visited Open Foundation in May. And we talked about uh, the MDMA for social anxiety study with autistic people, and so that was a great success. Where we found that MDMA assisted psychotherapy for social anxiety was really worked very well for our autistic research participants. I honestly, I have um, I'm not reading every bit of research that comes along. I've just been too darn busy. So, as far as I know, there has not yet been psilocybin, or like treating depression in autistic people specifically. I'd like to see more of that, because part of the rationale for doing an MDMA assisted psychotherapy for social anxiety, study with autistic people, is that it is a population that is difficult to treat with conventional non-psychedelic methods often, right? I mean, what do you do with social anxiety? You know, the go-to treatment for intense social anxiety for is usually CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Um, and uh, that does not work for most autistic people because it was designed for non-autistic cognitive patterns. Cognitive behavioral, you can't do a standard course of like cognitive behavioral therapy stuff because uh it presupposes a particular style of cognition. And if your client doesn't have that style of cognition, it's just garbage. It just doesn't work. You know, you're trying to program a computer in a language different from the language the operating system was written in. You know, it's just not gonna happen. So I think that's part of it is like, okay, well, we're looking for effective treatments. And I think with depression, similarly, like I think what I recommend instead of CBT depends on what you're treating and who you're treating. Um, again, we can't overgeneralize too much. I'm not a fan of CBT in general, for anybody, because I think it's too mechanistic and too symptom focused and doesn't get into the roots. I mean, I am I'm very psychodynamically oriented myself. I think, I'm a big fan of like, even if it takes longer, you don't want to be just addressing the surface symptoms. You want to get down there and into the roots of things. And so, I love psychedelic assisted therapy for that sort of thing, get down under the hood, get down into the roots of things, get down into the deep, uproot the psychological defenses and, make deep level changes in character structure. Um, at a bodily level, work somatically, work psychedelically, work psychodynamically, all of those in combination. And so I think for autistic people, I mean, again, don't want to stereotype, but often, um, uh, because of the way we process information, we tend to be very curiosity driven. And so I think I think psychodynamic approaches, I think somatic and psychodynamic approaches. Oh, I see an IFS person in there. And I agree. Yeah, see that's psychodynamic, right? That's, it's getting down into the, what's happening in the unconscious, what are the deep internal states, what's happening sort of below the level of just a person's conscious thought processes. And I think that's crucial for people in general. Again, I'm a fan of that for everybody, but I think for autistic people, uh, that's great. I think that psychoanalytic, psychodynamic sorts of approaches have generally been underexplored with autistic people. Um, Psychoanalysis dropped the ball early, right? Uh, the early, when autism first sort of became known as a phenomenon in the 1940s, uh, and you had psychologists like Leo Kanner and Bruno Bettelheim, exploring it from a psychoanalytic perspective. Neurodiversity wasn't on their radar. They were regarding autism as some sort of trauma response to bad parenting and thinking that, oh, autistic kids can like be shocked out of their autistic withdrawal. And so they grossly mishandled the whole autism thing. And And the field of psychodynamic psychology hasn't really gotten back to looking at autism and saying, well, now that we understand autism better, what about just like psychoanalytic, psychodynamic sort of types of treatment for autistic people's issues, for their anxiety, for their depression? I mean, it works for non-autistic people, and here we have this population that's, uh, has the patience and focus for deep analytic inquiry. So I'd love to see more of that, and I think that psychedelics are uh, a valuable adjunct to that to psychodynamic approaches because um, they really plunge you into the world of your unconscious material. So I would love to see more of that happening. Um, and um, again, I think if again, I think that um, it's sometimes valuable to take, like we did with the social anxiety study, to take a specific autistic group of, like, okay, a lot of autistic people experience social anxiety, and the standard methods like CBT don't work well for them. So, let's do a specific autism focused study, take autistic people specifically who are suffering from social anxiety, do MDMA assisted therapy for them. But I'd like to see again just more autistic people in general studies. You do a general study for using psilocybin to treat depression. Make sure there's some autistic participants, and and see how they do with the protocols that are working for all of the other participants. And I think people will be sur pleasantly surprised at the results. I think you'll find. I think we'll find if we started doing that more, um, just being inclusive and you know being aware of who's autistic within our group of participants, but really giving everyone the same basic treatment protocols. I think there's interesting things that will emerge there, and we might discover differences, on the whole between autistic and non-autistic experience. But um, I think that often we'll find that, oh, it just works for autistic people and non-autistic people both, and even if the nature of the experience is slightly different.
I'm really sad to say we're coming up onto the end of our conversation already. Time flies. I want to check, Nick, if you have space to take maybe one more question, and to just also give permission to those of you that have anticipated to be here only 15 minutes past the hour to leave us. But thank you very much for coming, and we will publish the recordings of this conversation online as well, like the last one. Nick, do you have time
I
for
I can
yeah?
take two more questions, sure.
Perfect,
Let's
perfect.
do it. They're so good, right? They're such good questions.
Um,
I see one in
yeah,
the
yeah,
chat about
yeah,
cyberdelics.
yeah.
Um,
You want to take
and
that?
I don't know. I'd love to hear more about what cyberdelics are. I don't know the term. That's a new one on me.
I must say, I thought I was pretty well initiated into the discourse too. And cyberdelics, I'm curious if what is meant here is that we use computer technology or IT to induce a non-ordinary state of consciousness. Is that what we're talking about?
Okay, well, I'm gonna just click on the link here.
Claire says it's altered states induced by non-chemical means, i.e., VR, light, sound, etc.
I'm seeing on this link I clicked. Well, Daniel, you put this question in the chat. Do you want to unmute and tell us something about cyberdelics? Because I want to learn what I'm seeing in the see VR and cybernetics, supersymmetrical patterns, alteration of consciousness introduced by technological tools. I see. In combination with psychedelic substances.
That would be weird.
Oh,
But yeah, basically
okay.
we're using VR, so this
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
reality state to modulate the experience of certain, like this can be useful for trauma therapy or for trying to
Yeah,
be
yeah.
seen or re-experience it and revisit it and then map the delta and the growth between several development steps or time.
Well, this is really exciting.
And you can self-modulate it and self-regulate it, and this is like a cool fidgety toy that goes naturally.
Okay, yeah, I have encountered this stuff and not known the term not known the term cyberdelics, but I have encountered this sort of tool, probably not as well developed as it is right now.
I am
Um,
so happy to have co-introduced this term to this audience.
oh,
Mwah.
wonderful.
Beautiful work.
Well, yeah, it's I mean, it's something else we should be experimenting with. It's something else I mean, I would categorize it the same way if it's creating that, uh, you know, if it's creating that sort of intense alteration of consciousness. And I'm very curious because I'm curious, you know, because I know, you know, cyberdelics can dramatically alter um, a state of consciousness. What I'm really curious about is with psychedelics in particular, psychedelic compounds, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca. The common factor with them that makes them so interestingly effective is that they open a window of increased neuroplasticity. And so I'm very curious about whether there's technological means that can do that. I haven't heard that. And so I'd love to see that studied more because that seems to me to be a crucial point. I will also say um uh using VR like light and sound and stuff. I mean, essentially it's technologically assisted stimming. So it seems perfect for autistic people because it's a stimming enhancer, especially if they can customize it to meet their own stimming needs. That sounds well worth exploring. Um, what was the other questions?
And there's one more question about AI as an assistant
Yeah.
for sessions, and I'm very curious about your take. I would love to share on that one too. But do you
Well,
want to go
I'm
first?
I'm I'm entirely anti-AI because of the environmental impact. I think you know, it's uh it's trendy. I'm suspicious, and the environmental impact is such. I mean, what are we doing here? What are we doing when we're exploring psychedelics? What like we talk about specific therapeutic applications and such in terms of clinical studies, but we're transforming consciousness. Whether that is specifically like healing trauma or something, or whether that's, psychological growth, spiritual growth, we're transforming consciousness. And part of the transformation of human consciousness that I think really needs to happen, and that I think psychedelics are going to play a very important role in, um, is connecting humans with each other and with the world more. That we live in a society of mass alienation. And I think psychedelics are part of the solution to that. People do, psilocybin, ayahuasca, MDMA, whatever psychedelic, they often come out of it with feelings of greater connectedness. They have this experience with MDMA, often an experience of deeper connection with other people, right? With ayahuasca, like often there's this intense connection to the natural and spiritual world. Psychedelics foster higher levels, deeper levels of connection. And ultimately, that's where the real transformative power lies, whether you're talking about connecting with your own unconscious or other people, the spiritual, the environmental. We're fostering deeper levels of connection in a way that sparks transformation. Um, AI destroys the environment. It's too wasteful of resources in terms of the power draw and the amount of water it uses and such. Um, Ignoring that is the opposite of the sort of connection that I think we should be trying to foster. So I am 100% anti-use of AI for anything.
I I want to echo a lot of that sentiment. I try to often remain agnostic because some of my some of my best friends are AI proponents, and
Mhm.
there seems to be an enthusiasm. And one thing that I find sad sometimes is that one of the main arguments I consistently hear is, well, AI will make mental health care accessible for all people at whatever the time of day.
Well,
And then my almost knee-jerk response is, so what you're doing is you're inventing a computer program to deal with the consequences of the way that we organize our social economy.
exactly.
And that
Exactly.
doesn't seem like the thing that we want to be doing. The original problem that people are pointing to is therapy is too expensive and there's too much poverty and there's too much racism and structural inaccessibility of some of these services.
Hmm.
And then when we add to the mix that just today, research came out that showed that multiple people talking to ChatGPT got into a psychosis because of how ChatGPT was encouraging them to follow through on certain ways of thinking, saying things to them like, oh, in that case, you must be a chosen one and you should help humanity awaken. There are so many ethical concerns with AI that even if I'm agnostic and generous and can really acknowledge, I know many people that have really benefited from doing IFS therapy with their ChatGPT bot. It's not my choice. I want to honor the fact that there's people that report really good things. It makes me sad to know that people need to do that instead of finding access to therapists, and it can also do real harm. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, just to echo then the sentiment that we're trying to build human connection, and that also means embodying human fallibility. Do we really want something that is quote unquote the perfect therapist, or just do we want to become comfortable with being with the fallible human connection and relationships? Um,
Right. Study
yeah,
after study has shown over the years that um, the in terms of the effectiveness of psychotherapy for healing, the biggest determining factor is not the type of psychotherapy done, but the quality of the therapist-client relationship. That these are reparative bonds between people, that this is ultimately about human connection, that even going back to Sigmund Freud, who seems very sterile and clinical by some modern standards, Freud said, ultimately psychotherapy is a work of love. And I think that's true. And so what's going on with AI? I mean, it's solipsistic, there is no other person there. And so, you know, it's all it's doing is externalizing a person's own mental chatter. And, maybe it can be helpful on the surface to some people, but it's not human connection. And it's um and having ChatGPT help you think something through, like people can report good results, but I'm thinking like you hear horror stories and terrible results. You also hear people report good results, but I think the results would be better if a person learned to think things through on their own or in collaboration with other humans. I mean, I really like, you know, I think asking ChatGPT or some other AI engine to do your therapy for you or do your introspection for you or something like that is like asking ChatGPT to go to the gym for you or to have sex for you. Like the point of the point of thinking these things through on your own or with other people is that in itself has a benefit. That in itself develops you in a particular way. And I think that we're not I think that outsourcing that stuff to ChatGPT is like outsourcing your exercise routine to a machine. You don't get developed by doing it. I mean, it's harder, you know, it's harder, but I think, that's good. I believe in hard work. I believe in effort. I believe that the effort of thinking something through on one's own or thinking something through in collaboration with other imperfect human beings, I think the effort itself pays off and develops us in particular ways. It doesn't happen when you're using AI.
And maybe a final note to those that are interested in using, especially ChatGPT. Recently, a report came out that showed that ChatGPT logs everything, and some things that
Mhm.
we ask ChatGPT can and will be used in court against people. So disclosing that you're engaging in illegal activity is usually ill-advised. Um, that was a fairly how should we say, critical ending to an otherwise incredibly optimistic and enriching evening, Nick. Thank you very much for your
Uh,
insights, for your contributions. I just want to repeat what you said all the way in the beginning. Neuroqueer Heresies is an amazing book. I think it's a mandatory reading, and I look forward to hearing what revisions are going to come our way in the future. I heard that there's already things that you're rethinking now. Um,
mhm.
I know that you have a website, Nick. Is that a place where people can read some of your contemporary thinking or?
Yeah, neuroqueer.com is the website, and I haven't updated it for years, frankly. So
Okay.
it's a little behind. Eventually I'll do post things on it like the video of this talk, for instance, will be there eventually. It's just I've been too busy to update for a long time, but eventually new material will show up there someday.
All right. Any final words you wish to offer?
I just thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you all for being here, for asking great questions.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of Open Foundation, thank you all for coming. And then Yulia always asks me to say something.
I
Yes,
just
there we go.
throw in the
Yeah,
chat. You can also just leave it there. We leave space for people to read it, and we just end it with this. Cool.
thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye bye.
Good night.
Or good day, wherever you are on this planet.